Okay, our speaker today is Dick Miller. He has given a talk to us in the past, about 2 or 3 years ago, on the separation of church and state. And the title of this talk, as you probably are aware, is The Enlightenment in America. And it's actually called now also by another name, and that's the Age of Reason, the Scientific Revolution, and the Enlightenment was a critical, important era in the development of how we think about our world, our culture, and our lives. It directly affected our government very significantly. Dick he served in the U.S. Navy aboard the Polaris submarine. After leaving the Navy, he worked for several high-tech firms, including IBM and Intel, primarily in the area of training and development, where he taught internal and customer design engineering systems, architecture, high-speed system design, and microprocessor architecture. Since retiring, he has become, he says active. I say very active. He's very much involved in the issues that are important to us. He's a member of the ACLU, American Humanist, vice president of the Phoenix chapter of the Americans United for Separation of Church and State, and the Phoenix Freedom from Religion Foundation, Valley of the Sun chapter. So let's give Dick a big hand and welcome him in, okay?
Okay, so we're going to talk about the Enlightenment philosophers and their effect on the founding of the United States. If I can get this to work. There we go. So we'll talk about Thomas Hobbes first. And Thomas Hobbes lived from 1588 to 1679. 1588, the year of the Spanish Armada, and England becoming a naval power, etc., overcoming Spain. And notice the dates here. We'll take a look in a moment at, I thought perhaps, I think I'm somehow missing a slide that showed the dates of all of these philosophers, but they were all at the same period just before and during the American Revolution. And that's significant because they directly affected the American Revolution. Now, Hobbes wrote a book called Leviathan, which I know this is a very literate and academic audience, so I'm sure you're aware of it. He wrote Leviathan, which referred to a mythological biblical sea monster capable of devouring entire ships, and he likened that to the government. This was published in 1651. And his famous line in Leviathan, Hobbes said that the state of nature in which all individuals are naturally equal and each person is free to do whatever is needed to survive because all are at war with all the time, but all suffer from continued fear and danger of violent death, and the life of man was solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. And that had a certain amount of truth at the time. So to avoid that poor, nasty, brutish, and short lifetime, people should lay down, give up their natural rights of equality and freedom and give absolute power to the sovereign, the Leviathan. The sovereign, he thought, could be either a person or a group, but he tended to like monarchy, as a lot of even philosophers did at that time. And the sovereign makes and enforces laws to secure a peaceful society, making life, liberty, and property possible. Now, we're going to see that several times today, and it's familiar. Life, liberty, and property from our Declaration of Independence. And Hobbes was one of the early philosophers that mentioned that. And he warned against the church meddling with the king's government. The king's power was absolute, and he didn't need any interference from the church, which sort of muddled things. Religion could become a source of civil war, which England had just endured from 1642 to 1651. They actually beheaded the king and had a huge upset and civil war. So in Hobbes' view, the church should become a department of the sovereign's government. Just that, just a department. And the sovereign or the sovereign's government would closely control all religious affairs. And as a matter of fact, that had been put into effect in England in 1534 when Henry VIII, because he couldn't get a divorce and wanted one, broke from the church in Rome and established the Anglican Church and became, in addition to being the head of the state, the head of the church. And his word was law, literally, in both realms. So in any conflict between the divine and sovereign law, the individual must obey the sovereign or choose death. So Hobbes was really serious about this. Either you obey the king in all things or choose death. Now, fortunately, he didn't play a major part in the founding of the United States. So here's Montesquieu, and he's 1689 to 1775, just before the Revolution. He was French, a lawyer and a political philosopher. He traveled a great deal, and I think he spent 3 years in England. And one of the principal things that he did when he traveled was study the form of government of the country he was in and what it was about, how it worked, and then included that in his philosophy. And his best known work and most influential work was The Spirit of Laws. That was in 1748, and he analyzed the varieties of human society to compare and classify them and study their institutions. Now, we're going to talk a lot about Montesquieu today because he probably had more influence on the American Revolution and the founding of the United States than any other of the philosophers. His most famous contribution is his theory of separation of powers. So he said when you form a government, or in a government, there should be a separation of power rather than all power residing with the sovereign. And powers should not be contained in one entity, one person or one small group. And if you are going to have different groups, then between those groups, you need a system of checks and balances. So each one checks and balances the other. And that's now familiar in our government. Each part has its own powers and also some powers of the other. This prevents one branch from becoming supreme, and this is ironic. It protects the opulent minority from the majority. At that time, this was sort of a democratic viewpoint, and at that time, democracy was viewed more as mob rule, and that the great unwashed would run amok, and which they did in the French Revolution, right? And so that's how they pictured this, so that they had to protect the rich minority from the poor. And it is to the advantage of each branch to cooperate with the others. And in Montesquieu's view, the people are sovereign, not the monarch or not even the government. It's the people that are sovereign. And the people may govern through others, but they must have the power of choosing those others by whatever means, but typically voting. And a fundamental part of a democratic government are laws governing voting, first of all, that you are permitted to vote, and then suffrage, who is permitted to vote. And he talked about political virtue, which requires the love of the laws and of our country. The most important thing is adhering to established law. And we have some county registrars that should pay attention to that. Now, the virtue a democracy requires does not come naturally. It requires a constant preference of public to private interest, so that each one of these people in the government, in whatever department, should be thinking about the public good rather than their personal good. And I think we can safely say that we still have that problem. And it should be a self-renunciation, which is ever arduous and painful. Also, in Montesquieu's view, to produce this unnatural self-renunciation required the whole power of education. If you're going to let the people be sovereign and in effect make the decisions, then you need to educate the people. So a democracy must educate its citizens to identify their interests with the interests of their country, and should have censors to preserve its mores, its characteristic customs and conventions. And here is a sort of a difficulty. At that time, not just Montesquieu, but pretty much everyone thought that democracy might be a good thing. You had to worry about this mob rule, and it was good only in small territories. So small territories are needed so citizens can identify with them, and it is harder for private interests to become established. And that thinking strongly influenced both our Continental Congress and our Constitutional Convention, which wanted to keep wanted states to keep certain powers. The Constitutional Convention and the Continental Congress, they had just, or were in the process of separating from England, and one of the reasons they were doing that was because of the sovereign power of the king, and they distrusted that, and they didn't want to set up that same form of government in the United States where the federal government was all powerful and the states had little or nothing to say about that. Plus, they had the additional problem of states' rights, which meant, in effect, our peculiar institution, slavery in the South, which was a horrendous sticking point in forming the United States. And democracies can be corrupted, according to Montesquieu, in two ways. The spirit of inequality, where my interests are more important than the country's interests, and the spirit of extreme equality or anarchy. I have no respect for my representatives or magistrates, magistrates here loosely being anyone elected or anyone in power, and I want to do all the governing personally. And we can still see both of those problems today. So the spirit of inequality arises when citizens don't identify with the interest of the country. It's my ideology or my group or whatever that is more important than the interest of the country. And therefore they try to advance their private interest at the expense of the interests of their fellow citizens and the country as a whole. And they want to acquire political power over them. And we see that constantly, our concept of the filibuster, where the minority gets to, in effect, control what goes on. Now, the spirit of extreme equality, the people choose magistrates, elected officials, to exercise executive power, and hopefully they respect and obey the magistrates they have chosen. And if these magistrates forfeit their respect, they are replaced. You have new elections and you get rid of the current government and replace it. But when the spirit of extreme equality takes root, citizens do not respect or obey the magistrates, and in effect, we have anarchy. Liberty is a tranquility of mind arising from the opinion each person has of his or her safety. And liberty is not the freedom to do anything you want, because if you are free to harm others, then others are free to do the same to you, and no one is safe. So to Montesquieu, living under the law is equal to liberty. Liberty involves living under laws which protect you while allowing you to do as much as possible without harming others. And citizens feel confident that if they obey the laws, the power of the state will not be directed against them. But we're seeing some real violations of that now, the problems that a lot of people now are having with police brutality, for instance. And this was similar to Hobbes' idea of giving up some personal liberty to enjoy safety and security, and obviously some of that is always necessary. Now, this was another of Montesquieu's ideas that was put into place by our Constitutional Convention. Only the legislative branch has the power. I'm sorry, I mistyped that. No, it's only the, yes, that's correct. Only the legislative branch has the power. In the United States, that's the House of Representatives, the lower house. Okay, so they have the only power to tax, as does our House of Representatives, and the legislature can also deprive funding to the executive branch, and we're seeing a lot of that going on. We're going to defund this or that or shut down the government, okay? The legislature can deprive funding to an executive that arbitrarily tries to impose the executive's will, and it demonstrably does so by shutting down the government or defunding a part of the government. And all of this goes right back to Montesquieu. He also advocated a bicameral. The executive power should have the right to veto acts of the legislature. The legislature should be composed of two houses, an upper and a lower. And no one was quite certain how those two houses should be selected. In England, the upper house was hereditary and the lower house was elected. And some people here thought that might be a good idea. And each house should be able to stop the other from enacting a law. So to become a law, a bill or a proposal has to go through both houses, and that's now part of our government. And Montesquieu advocated an independent judiciary. It should be independent of all other branches of government, should restrict itself to applying the laws to particular cases in a fixed and consistent manner. So to Montesquieu, the judiciary simply applied the law. They didn't examine the law to see whether or not it was proper. That came about a lot later. So the judicial power, so terrible to mankind, becomes, as it were, invisible, and people fear or respect the office, but not the magistrate. And that was his idea. You don't have to be afraid of the judge. The judge is supposed to be just and impartial, etc. So you respect the office. And liberty also requires that the laws concern only threats to public order and security. Those laws will protect us while leaving us free to do as many other things as possible, and that's a good idea. So the laws should not concern offenses against God, since he does not require their protection. As a matter of fact, in the Constitutional Convention in 1787, on June 28th, they'd been in session for about 5 or 6 weeks, and they weren't getting anywhere. And Benjamin Franklin, surprisingly, got up and proposed that perhaps they should start each day with a prayer so that they can make a little progress. And John Dickinson stood up and said, "No, we don't need any foreign influence." So, laws should not prohibit what they do not need to prohibit. Don't enact a law just because you can. All punishment not derived from necessity is tyrannical. A few months ago, up at ASU, Lawrence Krauss at the Origin Center sat down and had a conversation with Noam Chomsky, and Noam Chomsky is very big on this. Anything that the government does that it doesn't have to do is tyranny. And the law is not a mere act of power. Things in their own nature indifferent are not within its province. So the government as a whole should be cautious about enacting laws and do only what they have to. Laws should make it as easy as possible for citizens to protect themselves from punishment by not committing crimes. It should be easy not to commit a crime. And the laws should not be vague. If they are, we might never be sure whether or not what we're doing is a crime, and others might be able to interpret it differently. Law should make it as easy as possible for an innocent person to prove his or her innocence, and they should concern actions only, since no one can prove what another person has thought. And it used to be that, particularly with institutions like the Inquisition, the accusation was enough. He's guilty. I think he's a witch or whatever, and that was enough. If you were accused, you were guilty. Now, the next philosopher we'll talk about is John Locke, 1632 to 1704. And he studied science and medicine at Oxford and became a professor there. And he sided with the Protestant Parliament against the Roman Catholic Stuart king, James II, in the Glorious Revolution of 1688. Now, if you're familiar with the Tudors and Stuart, that's one of the reasons that our Constitutional Convention went for not making this a religious nation, because they had had about a 200-year history in England of, we would have, well, for instance, Henry VIII. Initially was Catholic and had studied for the priesthood because his brother was supposed to be king. And then when he became king, he was Catholic, and you were in trouble if you weren't Catholic, but there was very little of that. And then in 1534, because he wanted to get a divorce and remarry, he started the Anglican Church, Church of England, and that was, if it wasn't Catholic, it was Protestant. So now you had to swear an oath. I'm no longer Catholic, I'm a Protestant, and I swear to obey the king's laws, etc. And if you didn't, he would behead you. His chief advisor, Thomas More, man for all seasons, and a lot of others. And then Henry died. His son became king for a short while, and he was sort of indifferent. He was sickly, etc. It didn't last too long, a few years. And when he died, a sort of distant relative, Lady Jane Grey, was queen for 9 days. And then Henry's daughter Mary, Bloody Mary, became queen, and she was Catholic. And not only that, she was devout Catholic, and she was sickly. And she thought that the reason she was sickly was that she wasn't punishing the Protestants quickly enough. And whenever any of her people tried to say, oh, we really shouldn't execute this guy, no, do it and do it now, okay? And Bloody Mary, in her 5 or so years, burned about 300 people just because they were Protestant. Now, later on, her sister Elizabeth came to power, and Elizabeth ruled for 40-something years. And it isn't widely noted, but she killed about she was Protestant, and she killed about as many Catholics as Bloody Mary had burned Protestants, but she just didn't do it as quickly. So we had seen this back and forth where you would get a new monarch and you had to say, okay, and you had to write it, swear it, I'm no longer what he was, now I am whatever it is you are, okay? So it became a good idea to take religion out of government. And then this sort of culminated in this glorious revolution of 1688, where they had been through the Civil War, and then the Stuart kings had come in, and there were still the back and forth. So in 1688, they had the glorious revolution, and they deposed the Stuart king, James II, and banished him, and made Parliament the major authority in English government, and brought in William and Mary. Now, this isn't the same Mary. That was, Bloody Mary was Mary Tudor. This is Mary Stuart, and they decided to bring in a man, William of, They brought in William of Orange to marry Mary, And the initial intent was for him to be sort of a consort. And he said, no, if I'm going to do this, I want to be co-sovereign. So he was king and she was queen, thus William and Mary. Now, Locke published 2 treatises of government in 1690, and he generally agreed with Hobbes about the brutality of the state of nature. And he said what we need to correct that is a social contract. And we're going to see other social contracts. But a social contract is required to assure peace, and he disagreed with Hobbes on 2 major points. Locke said that natural rights, such as life, liberty, and property, and he used those terms again, exist in the state of nature. They are natural rights and cannot be taken away or even voluntarily given up. They're yours, they are unalienable, and he used the term, unalienable, they can't be taken away, and they can't even be given up. They are impossible to surrender. He also disagreed with Hobbes about the social contract. Hobbes had said the social contract is that the people make a contract with the sovereign, that the sovereign's will is absolutely supreme. And Locke said that the social contract is an agreement between the people and the sovereign. He preferred a king, but not just among the people, and the king's power or the sovereign's power is no longer, in Locke's view, absolute. So the natural rights of individuals limit the power of the king or the sovereign. And the king does not hold absolute power, but acts only to enforce and protect the natural rights of the people. And this is what came about as a result of the Glorious Revolution in 1688, where the absolute power was taken from the monarch. James II, whom they banished, had really been big on that. It was sort of like Nixon, whatever the president does is legal. And James II said, whatever the king does is obviously correct because he's the king and that's the way God wanted it. So now, after the Glorious Revolution, the king does not hold absolute power, but acts only to enforce and protect the natural rights of the people, which cannot be taken away. And if the king violates these rights, the social contract is broken. And if the social contract is broken, the people have the right to revolt and establish a new government when in the course of human events, etc. Sound familiar? So Thomas Jefferson used these concepts in writing the Declaration of Independence. Do you have a question, sir? Oh, I thought you were raising your hand. And Locke spoke out for freedom of thought, speech, and religion, but he believed property to be the most important natural right. Property was a big issue then. For instance, I think you're all aware that if you displeased the king in England, he could simply take your property. Cardinal Wolsey, for instance, when Henry VIII got tired of Cardinal Wolsey, banished him and took all of his property. And Locke said that owners may do whatever they want with their property so long as they do not invade the rights of others. So my right to swing my fist ends short of your nose. And government is mainly necessary to promote the public good, to protect property, encourage commerce, and little else. So Locke's advice was govern lightly. And he favored a representative government that was chosen by the people, such as the English Parliament. Now, he liked the idea of a hereditary upper house, the House of Lords, and an elected lower house, the House of Commons. And everyone we talk about today had this same idea that only adult male property owners should have the right to vote. So there was no consideration of women voting, and there was no consideration, and usually they would establish a value. If you don't own this much property or have this much cash, you don't vote. Because they believed those without property were unfit to participate in government. The supreme authority of government should reside, according to Locke, should reside in the lawmaking legislature, as in England's Parliament after the Glorious Revolution, and the executive and judicial branches should be creations of the legislature and under its authority. So they didn't have, or he didn't have, the idea of the Supreme Court being sort of, it may be independent, but it was under the control, ultimately, of the legislature. Now, Rousseau, again, 1712, 1778, he died just at the time of the American Revolution, and he was a different sort of guy. Rousseau was an extreme Democrat. The powerful and rich stole the land, which belongs to all citizens, and fooled the common people into accepting them as rulers, just as we see now the common complaint that in the United States a lot of the middle class folks are voting against their own economic interests. And this is Rousseau's idea that the rich and powerful fooled the common people into allowing them, the rich and powerful, to essentially own everything. And in his view, that was a social contract. This social contract, where the rich own everything, is not an agreement made willingly. People didn't willingly do that. They were fooled, as Hobbes, Locke, and Montesquieu believed. Instead, to Rousseau, the social contract, as it is a fraud against the people committed by the rich. And in 1762, Rousseau published his most important work on political theory, The Social Contract. So social contract was a very common term then. A lot of thought went into it. His opening line, probably his most famous line, "Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains." And Rousseau agreed with Locke that individuals should never be forced to give up their natural rights to a king or to a government. And his social contract, Rousseau's social contract, differs from Hobbes, Montesquieu, and Locke. Instead of agreeing to the social contract with the sovereign, the citizens should have a social contract with one another and leave the government out of it in a sense. Power lies with the community, not the king. The government, the king, was more like an administrator. The people should then exercise their general will to make laws for the public good. And according to Rousseau, the general will of the people cannot be decided by elected representatives. They have nothing to say in it. He wanted a direct democracy in which everyone votes to express the general will and make the law of the land, and he meant that as a literal show of hands. At election time, in effect, nobody was in charge, but you went to the public square, laws were proposed, and, yeas and nays. And as a matter of fact, that process, I'm not certain that they're still doing it, but I know that at least in some of the rural areas in Switzerland, in the villages, they've been doing this until very recently. The people of the village literally show up in the square and they have a show of hands vote on issues, and also until very recently, women didn't have the vote. So Rousseau had in mind a democracy on a small scale, again, small scale, which was a general idea, and for our purposes in the United States, sort of unfortunate because it raised this whole issue of states' rights. So he had in mind democracy on a small scale, similar to the way that Montesquieu had thought. And all political power must reside with the people. There can be no separation of powers, as Montesquieu proposed. The people, meeting together, deliberate and find the general will. So there's no separation of powers because there aren't any powers other than the people as a whole. And this influence is seen in his phrase, "we the people," at the beginning of the US Constitution. Rousseau thought that religion divides and weakens the state, and he said, "It is impossible to live in peace with people you think are damned." And boy, we're seeing that today, aren't we? So he favored a civil religion that accepts God. Yeah, there's a God out there, but he concentrates on the sacredness of the social contract. So God is sort of a secondary consideration. We, the people, the will of the people is supreme. He said that he realized his vision of democracy would be difficult to maintain, and he warned that as soon as any man says of the affairs of state, "What does it matter to me?" the state may be given up for lost. And that looks like that's a pretty true statement. And it also reflects Montesquieu's spirit of inequality, where I don't care about the government, I'm more important than the government. As the recent county clerk said, you know, the Supreme Court doesn't get to make the law, I make the law. Okay, here's David Hume. He was a Scottish philosopher, essayist, economist, historian, and known for philosophical empiricism. Empiricism just being that whatever you do, it has to be based on experience. All rationally acceptable beliefs or propositions are justifiable or knowable only through experience. And Hume influenced our founding fathers with his combination of Newton's scientific methodology and his work built on the philosophy of John Locke. He stressed the importance of the rule of law and moderation in politics, and he said society is best governed by a general and impartial system of laws based principally on the artifice of contract. He saw that contract as sort of artificial or made up. And he was less concerned about the form of government, whether it was a monarchy or representative or whatever, that administers the laws, so long as it does so fairly, but thought that republics were probably more likely to do so than monarchies. He envisioned a strict separation of powers, decentralization, again, small territories decentralized, voting rights for anyone who holds property of value, and one of my favorites, limiting the power of the clergy. And he proposed the Swiss militia system as the best model of protection. Rather than have a standing army, which could be used against you, which England did, etc., the Swiss militia system, it was more like what we would think of as the National Guard, where to this day, pretty much every Swiss has an army rifle that he keeps in the basement, and he goes off and marches for 2 weeks a year, you know, in the Swiss militia. And elections should take, I love this, elections should take place annually, and representatives are to be unpaid. Wow, what a difference that would make. And he said governments are founded and legitimized by these three, what he referred to as opinions: public interest, meaning what's best for the public; the right to power, the government must be legitimate; and the all-important individual citizens' right to property. All governments and all authority of the few over the many should be founded on these three principles. And he wrote about synthetic and analytic truths. Synthetic truths are those that they just say are out there, that are sort of natural, and analytic, those that we think about. and he helped inspire the concept of self-evident truths in the Declaration of Independence. That was his analytic. And his friend Benjamin Franklin changed Jefferson's language in the Declaration of Independence from, Jefferson had originally written, "We hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable." And Franklin, who was friends with Hume, had him change that to, "We hold these truths to be self-evident." And what an enormous difference that would have been with those who believe that this is a Christian nation, had that phrase been sacred and undeniable rather than self-evident. And this important change reflects a statement grounded in reason and rooted in the principles of the scientific revolution. By this time, we had Newton and Leibniz and Descartes and Spinoza, et cetera, and Boyle and Hooke. So science was coming along, and we were finding out that when you thought about something, the answer didn't have to be because God made it that way. Now we could actually, using science and the scientific method, figure out why it was that way. And instead of the idea that equality of all men is an article of religious faith, now we could prove it on a scientific basis. So let's go back over quickly all of the well, not all, but the 5 philosophers we've talked about today. Hobbes said that in nature, each man is equal to another. We are all free, but freedom requires us to fend for ourselves. Life is tough. And we should give up this freedom to enjoy the rule and protection of a sovereign, which was Hobbes' social contract. Follow all the rules, and life isn't quite so hard, and the sovereign rules all aspects of our lives, including religion, and to disagree with the sovereign is death. Montesquieu, 3 branches of government, with a bicameral house, upper and lower, mutually exclusive legislative veto, meaning that in our case, in our example, the Senate and the House can each block the other from passing a law, and executive veto, so that once those two have passed a law, the executive can still veto it. Now, I don't think that Montesquieu envisioned a legislative override of the veto that came along later, but you can see that all of these ideas of Montesquieu were incorporated into our form of government. The legislative power to defund the executive and an independent judiciary. Separation of powers is the most famous idea. Checks and balances then among those powers. The people are sovereign and they choose their leaders via these suffrage laws, who's allowed to vote. And political virtue requires educating the people to put the needs of the many above personal desires and needs. And again, effective democracies, they thought, or he thought, must be relatively small. And you can see some justification for that. They didn't have good means of communication then. About the fastest way to communicate essentially was with a horse. Okay, so you didn't have instant communication and social media and all of that. Our liberty, tranquility, requires that we agree to live under laws. The laws must be real, or must address real, specific problems. They must be clear rather than vague, and they should not concern offenses against God. Our our state of nature requires a social contract, not just an agreement among the people, as Rousseau thought, but between the people and the sovereign. And our unalienable natural rights cannot be given away or taken away. Property is the most important natural right, and we can do whatever we want with our property as long as it doesn't harm others. The executive's job, this is Locke. The executive's job is to enforce and protect the natural rights of the people, life, liberty, and property. If the executive fails to do so, the people have the right to revolt. That was important. Government modeled on the English Parliament and should govern lightly. Only adult male property owners should be able to vote, and the legislature should control the executive and judicial, in Locke's view. Rousseau, the powerful rich stole the land, and the social contract that he saw in effect at the time was a fraud. Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains. And in his view, the people were sovereign. Again, he envisioned small-scale direct democracy, literal show of hands for voting. Religion divides and weakens the state, and his most important phrase was, "We the people." And then Hume, he believed in philosophical empiricism and, I didn't mention it earlier, but utilitarianism, meaning whatever works. Okay? And for that reason and others in our government, Jefferson initially liked Hume, but later really disliked him and actually banned his writings from the University of Virginia. So Hume believed in the rule of law and moderation, annual elections and unpaid representatives, and the government should be based on three opinions: serving the public interest, the legitimate right to power, and maintaining the right to property. Thank you.
Anyone have any questions?
Yes. Well, one of the points that was made here is that the laws must be clear. And if you don't have a written law, you can't be clear. And my God, we have 49 opinions on what the law means now, and if it weren't written, how many would we have?
I see. Yeah, that makes sense, doesn't it? Well, what about England, though? Do they have a written constitution?
Oh, yes, certainly. Well, first of all, from June 15th of 1215, they have the Magna Carta.
Right.
And then from the Glorious Revolution of 1688, they have in effect, a constitution that limited the power of the king and elevated the power of Parliament. So now we're all aware that the royalty are sort of a figurehead, and the Parliament really runs England under a set of written laws. I don't think they refer to it as the Constitution, but nevertheless they have written laws to which they adhere.
Thank you very much. I
Sure.
appreciate that.
I probably have about 100 questions, but let me stick to just one.
Thank you.
Locke seems to have a complex and even contradictory relationship with the notion of slavery. What have you learned, especially with respect to his feelings about property?
As a matter of fact, I've been reading recently quite a bit. I get interested in something and then I read a shelf of books about it. And I've been reading about the Civil War. And there were those, because it was in their economic interest to support slavery, who really seriously believed that slavery was a good thing. Not only was it good for the country, and it was good for the South economically, it was even good for those who were slaves. And Ben Carson repeated that the other day. He said that slavery may be the best thing that ever happened to the black man. The Southern Baptist Church was founded in the Civil War period on the basis of supporting slavery. So there were those who said, we've done the black man a huge favor. We brought him over here, we feed him, clothe him, house him, take care of all of his needs, and we brought him to Christ. And had we left him in Africa, he would have been back in that poor, short, nasty, brutish state of nature. So there were people, John Calhoun, who vociferously defended slavery and really, honestly, thought it was a good thing. Oh, I don't think Locke directly addressed it that much. Not that I recall. I wasn't even aware. That could be. I don't know. Okay.
Anybody else?
It seems that the comment that a number of these philosophers saw the idea of a small area as being crucial for their ideas to actually work. And it seems odd that, and it's understandable at the time, given the technology that existed, the way things worked, that you needed to have a small area. And it seems like the major flaw that I see in our Constitution is this insistence on having states' rights at a time when those kind of geographic restrictions no longer exist. And it seems to contradict this idea that we are a nation, and yet we still maintain this idea that we're individual little states. And
well, this was forced into the Constitutional Convention because there was a huge difference between the southern states with their peculiar institution and the northern states. And then there was another divide, the small states and the big states. For instance, how do we count people? And how do we elect the government so that, in effect, we get one man, one vote? So that's why we came up with two houses, so that the Senate has, no matter the population, you get two representatives, and the House was by population. And then the South said, wait a minute, how are we going to count the population? Because at the time of the Civil War, if you look at the South, the North had about 20 million people. The South had about 10 million people, and almost half of them were slaves. So in effect, they had about 5 million people, what were considered people. But if we're going to allow you to vote and elect a representative based on people, the South said, well, then obviously blacks are people. We're going to count them. Okay, and now we have to tax you based on your population. Oh, well, then obviously blacks aren't people. So there was a compromise, the infamous compromise, where blacks, for both purposes, were counted as 60% of a person. And that was a huge sticking point. And if they, the 55 guys that wrote the Constitution, if they hadn't been able to compromise, we would never have become a nation. So that was a huge compromise, but it was absolutely necessary, and we couldn't have become a nation without it. And the South was very adamant. Well, and as a matter of fact, a lot of factions were adamant that they did not want a large umbrella federal government, which would be, in their opinion, similar to the large umbrella British government that had exercised too much power over them. So they wanted power distributed to the states. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
A brief question. Did any of these philosophers or founding fathers question the existence of God? In other words, were any real atheists?
I don't know that any were avowed atheists. It hadn't been that long since you could be burned at the stake for saying you were an atheist. As a matter of fact, the last Englishman was burned for heresy in 1612. And we're all familiar with Giordano Bruno in 1600. And you find very few elected people today that are willing to say they're an atheist. A couple, okay? It just wasn't done. And there probably weren't as many. Atheism, the nuns, N-O-N-E-S, the unaffiliated, are becoming much more dominant now. At that time, and a good deal of the people in the United States at that time, rather than being devout theists, were deists. They believed in the clockwork God, the God that had sort of wound the universe up and let it go and then no longer interfered with it. So, Franklin, Jefferson, Washington, Madison, Monroe, people like that were pretty much deists. They believed that because they had no better explanation, science hadn't advanced that far, so that they believed that there probably was a deity, but that he probably didn't act within the everyday world. And a lot of the 55 people the framers, the 55 people who wrote the Constitution, were probably deists. There was one clergyman among the 55.
Could you explain how the electoral college, it became a practical matter, but when did it occur that our representatives unpaid became an electrical, the college?
That was another compromise that was necessary primarily not between the slave states and free states, et cetera, but between the big states and the small states. And it was an attempt then to sort of get a one-man, one-vote situation. And it's kind of gotten out of hand since then. But that was another compromise that was necessary because more than 50% of the population at the time was concentrated in 4 of the colonies. And they didn't want those 4 colonies to gang up, form a majority, and do whatever the hell they pleased. So they didn't want, and they would not have accepted a simple majority vote. So that was an attempt to balance the populations of the small state with the large states. Oh, at the Constitutional Convention in 1787. It's built right into the Constitution.
One of the philosophers, I've forgotten his name, indicated there are 2 things that could be very corruptive of the government. And when you presented it, it seemed like this is what's happening right now in our government.
Yeah, the inequality and extreme equality. Yes, and actually we see a good deal of that now, don't we? People disregarding the law, saying, well, they may be the Supreme Court, but that's only 5 guys and they don't make the law, that sort of thing. I'm amazed that we essentially haven't made any progress since those days on those issues.
One thing that caught my attention was when you mentioned that laws, that the laws couldn't be vague, that laws that were created, and I see that in the courts, that's called upon many times by judges, even today. Make some comments about that.
Well, a good example of that, and a very appropriate example, look at the parsing of the Second Amendment and the commas in the Second Amendment. And Scalia's parsing, well, this comma indicates that it doesn't refer to a well-regulated militia. That's a separate issue. So, and obviously their standards of punctuation, then, not to mention their definition of words, okay, and they couldn't foresee the situations that were going to arise. It says, I can bear arms, therefore I am entitled to a tank and a bazooka.
I've been struggling with trying to figure out how to formulate this question, but the question of rights, we have, I would say, 2 kinds of rights. We have the right of equality and the right of freedom. As Jefferson talked about, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. He talks about equality, that they're endowed by the Creator with certain inalienable rights, and talks about life and liberty. As I say, I'm struggling here, but the Enlightenment philosophers and the whole idea of those rights, those two kinds of rights, by the way, equality on one hand and freedom on the other hand, are now represented by the extremes of our political polarity, but they had their common origin back there, I believe, in the Enlightenment philosophers, and they both refer to the rights that all individuals had. Would you have anything to say about that?
Well, I think they lived in a simpler world, and they didn't have all of these issues that we have, and they didn't think of addressing that I can view the oppression of you as my right, which we tend to be doing now. My religion says I have to do this, so therefore I have the right to enforce that view on you. And if you oppose that, you're oppressing my rights. And I don't think the philosophers then foresaw that. Is that?
What would these philosophers have to say regarding the idea that money is a form of free speech?
Oh, God, that's an interesting question. I don't think, obviously, that it occurred to them, although it was, I'm assuming that it was probably totally unlimited then. When you have an election, that then the wealthy and the powerful influenced that election, probably and perhaps unduly, just like we're seeing now. And again, they probably didn't foresee that it would come to this extreme. Yeah, that's an interesting question, and I don't think they addressed that. What are the rights of the rich compared to, although Rousseau would have had a lot to say about that, wouldn't he? Where he saw that the rich had stolen the property from us and convinced us to vote for their interests rather than our own.
There's sort of a corollary to that. It was explained to me recently that it has to do with, like, there's an analogy with advertisement. I mean, you can pay to have an advertisement that broadcasts your view. Well, in an absurd stretch of that, you could pay every paper in the nation to have your view broadcast in this huge, huge way. But isn't that a bit like tyranny?
Of course it is. As a matter of fact, I just saw a post on Facebook this morning that, and I've forgotten all of the numbers, but there are this many thousand newspapers and this many thousand radio stations and this many thousand TV stations, all of which are owned by 6 companies and 272 executives. So if you can convince those 6 companies to promulgate your views, you're in.
It seems to me that the people in Philadelphia did not contemplate the development.
I'm sorry.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. It seems to me that the people in Philadelphia did not contemplate the development of political parties, because it seems that the structure of government, as explained here, was to prevent government from misbehavior. But it seems now the political parties, striving to control both branches of the legislature, as well as the executive, and now even the judiciary, is in effect undoing the efforts of the people in Philadelphia to limit the misbehavior of government.
Well, and I'll just call them the framers, the 55 guys that wrote the Constitution, were divided into parties, although they didn't really use the term as we do. But there were the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, the Federalists who wanted that large umbrella federal government, and the Anti-Federalists that were more concerned with the states retaining rights, particularly the small and the southern states. So they didn't have a Republican and a Democrat party yet, but they did have Whigs and Tories, which were sort of something like our conservative and liberal. And during the Revolution, it was easy to remember the Whigs and Tories. The Whigs were we, and the Tories were the loyalists. Okay? So they did have political parties, and then that had sort of faded during the Constitutional Convention era into Federalist and Anti-Federalist. And then not long after that, parties, pretty much as we understand them, came about. There were still the Whigs, there were the Democrats, and then in Lincoln's time, he didn't found it, but he was one of the early members, the Republican Party. So they dealt with parties almost as we do. I don't think, I'm not certain. It'd be interesting to find out how much influence the wealthy had then in regard to simply donating money. But elections were kind of a simpler thing then. They traveled around. Obviously, you didn't have to pay for commercials, except in newspapers. But they simply traveled around and spoke to larger or smaller groups. Madison and Monroe even traveled together, even though they were enemies, and spoke together. So it wasn't, I think, as sharp, although, who was it? Adams and Jefferson in 1800 had like the most contentious election in U.S. history.
I'm interested in how civil disobedience fits into all of this.
I'm sorry?
Civil disobedience, and how does that relate to what you're talking about?
Right after the founding of the country, we had some civil disobedience. Are you familiar with Shays' Rebellion or the Whiskey Rebellion? That was civil disobedience, and George Washington rode out and put it down. And I just heard it mentioned the other night, there was after World War I, there was a soldiers' rebellion where they weren't getting care, etc. And our hero, General MacArthur, went and suppressed it and even fired on them and killed some. So they had civil disobedience then, just as we do now. It just didn't have the press that it has now.
One more question for me. I was perusing some of the constitutions that existed in the states prior to Philadelphia.
I'm sorry, I'm having a
I
problem.
was looking at some of the constitutions that occurred in the states prior to Philadelphia, and New York, and so forth.
The constitutions of the then colonies, and then after we became a nation, the states' constitution.
Okay, another question then. Prior to Philadelphia, then after the Revolution, they were individual nations, weren't they?
No, they viewed themselves as individual nations. Robert E. Lee said, "I won't attack my own country," and his country was Virginia. He was offered to be the commander-in-chief of the Union forces, and he said, "I can't do it. I would be attacking my own country." And it was the Civil War that changed that, where our country became the United States rather than our state.
Okay, so the individual constitutions in New York and in Massachusetts and so forth, I was reading where they were dealing with this problem of religion, in which they said that, at least a number of them said, that if you had to obey civil law, and you couldn't disobey civil law under the color of religion. So that would suggest that they were already dealing with this issue of the right of the individual through their own faith to supersede
Well,
law.
when the colonies, the British colonies, the 13 original, were founded, depending on how you count, either 8 or 9 of them had an established religion. The northern colonies were Puritan. The central colonies, 4 of them, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware, and Rhode Island, had no religion in their constitution. And New York had religion in the Constitution only for the 4 southernmost or more heavily populated counties, and they called them the metropolitan counties. And then the South was Anglican with a mixture of Baptist and Methodist, etc. But they had, in their colonial constitution, they had an established religion. And then when the federal Constitution was ratified in 1791, it said no states' religious strictures in the Constitution. You can't have an established religion, but they didn't enforce it. So all of the now states that had religion in their colonial constitutions, and even initially in their state constitutions, disestablished voluntarily, because the federal government didn't force them or couldn't force them to give it up. But each of those 8 now states did disestablish their religious clause. The last one was Massachusetts in 1832, and before that I think it was Connecticut in about 1820. So they still had religion in their state's constitution established, but they voluntarily gave it up over time.
I think it's Article 6, Paragraph 3 of the U.S. Constitution that says there shall be no religious test for public office.
And yet, 7 of our states currently still have a religious test.
Ouch. It wasn't, when that was put in there were states that had that statement.
There were colonies, yes.
And they, as you said, relinquished that.
Yes, over time. Now, this was a strange era because in the Constitution we had the Bill of Rights that was ratified at the same time as the rest of the Constitution, and that had freedom of press, freedom of religion, freedom of speech, right to assembly, yada, 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 and that everybody thinks, well, not everyone, but almost everyone thinks that when the Bill of Rights was ratified, that all of those rights applied across the United States to everyone. It didn't. As some of those didn't become established until the 1940s. And for instance, after the Constitution was ratified in 1791, and we have freedom of speech, a ship would leave, for instance, Massachusetts and go to South Carolina, and if anybody went ashore, they would be imprisoned automatically because they might say something against slavery. So it was against the law in the South after the Constitution, and they were states. It was against the law to say or write anything negative about slavery. And as a matter of fact, authors would write something in the North about slavery, and the South would indict them and try to extradite them. Seriously.
Anyone else with a question? Okay, let's give Dick a big hand. Dick Miller. Hey. Good job. Good job, Dick.
Thank you. I've really enjoyed it. You guys are always a good, pleasant audience.